Okay. My name is John Tucker, and last spring, Dr. Lodge approached me and asked me to help her look for materials for an introduction and appendices for her newly translated book, Notes from the Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky. So the goal of our project was to gather articles, works, and the history surrounding the novel. Another one was to analyze all the surrounding context. And the third was to give future readers a better understanding of the novel. And so here I will begin with an introduction, a brief introduction to the novel and its context. The context surrounding Notes from the Underground is deep and wide. The Underground Man is complex and not easily understood after the first read, the second read, or the third, which is why he has been so fascinating to so many people. In order to understand the novel and him, one must know the context and references found within its binding. Here I shall start my brief introduction and the background of the work. Dostoevsky, when first entering the literary circle of Russia, was captivated by the idealism of his time. He joined the Petrashevsky Circle, where the discussions of socialist ideas permeated and characterized every meeting. He was arrested and put under interrogation by a Tsarist commission which sought to quiet the voices of dissent. He was convicted of propagating socialistic ideology and sentenced to execution. But at the last minute, his punishment was altered, and he was instead sent to Omsk, Siberia for 4 years, followed by compulsory military service. Upon his return to Western Russia, his views seemed to change dramatically, taking a 180-degree turn. He rejected the ideas of his youth, and he now saw the influx of Western ideas as detrimental instead of beneficial to his country. The first man to influence him a great deal was a man named Charles Fourier. In the Napoleonic era, Charles Fourier conceived a philosophy of utopian ideology, known for his namesake Fourierism. It had penetrated Russia long before Dostoevsky started writing, but had been enough to incite a reaction from several of his characters, starting with works of Notes from the Underground and Possessed. The majority of Charles Fourier's ideology dealt with the establishing of phalanxes. Phalanxes were planned communities governed by the laws of attraction, and Fourier's own invention, the 12 calculated passions which composed the human nature. Fourier's concept of nature was established by what we will call the 3 eternal, uncreated, and indestructible elements. They were God or the spirit, the active and moving element, matter, the passive and moved element, and justice and mathematics, the element which regulates movement. He believed that God instated mathematical system bound to be mathematical for the cosmos. It was a system for him to work in, a system to constrict his creation. This allowed for him to act within a set framework of justice, a justice system that exists independently of himself. This system, it was laid out through predetermined calculations, and it also applies to the human condition as well. We are bound by the same predeterminism. Our passions are our drives. By them, we are guided. We follow a mathematical system that conducts the very physics of our existence. To oppose these passions was not simply to stop being governed by their influence. For if we are to truly believe that the 12 passions govern our nature, we will never succeed in abolishing them. We will only be repressing our knowledge of their presence while we are still guided by them. Fourier actually criticized many of the moralists of his time for attempting to repress the passions, like the Christians. He believed these passions were so critical to true vitality. In essence, this philosophy negates free will. Every action is predetermined. Even God is subject to a system outside of himself. This creates a theological paradox. The underground man responds saying, quote, The laws of nature need only to be discovered, and then man will no longer be answerable for his actions, and his life will become extremely easy. Needless to say, all human actions will then be calculated according to the mathematically bound laws, like a table of algorithms. Everything will be so precisely calculated and designated that there will no longer be any actions or adventures in this world. End quote. There will be nothing left to find out. There will be nothing left to discover. For reason's sake, reason will have discovered itself and no longer need to be used. Dostoevsky's first editor, who influenced him a great deal in his youth, saw traditional concepts of human nature as flawed. In the author's work, A Writer's Diary, he recalls an instance with Vissarion Belinsky, the editor of his magazine that he was writing for. One night he was sitting with Belinsky, and Belinsky stated, "Do you know that man's sins cannot be counted against him, that he cannot be laden down with the obligations and with the turning of with the other cheek when society is set up in such a mean fashion that a man cannot help but do wrong? Economic factors alone lead him to do wrong, and it is absurd and cruel to demand from a man something that the very laws of nature make it impossible for him to carry out, even if he wanted to." In essence, he was certain that morality ought to give way to science. Moral laws were static. They allowed for no change and expected man to perform to their expectations, even though such requirements were unattainable. Nikolai Chernyshevsky, who I will discuss later, and Dostoevsky, discuss a historical theorist named Henry Thomas Buckle, who placed the scientific method and the expansion of knowledge as the basis for historical development. These new mental laws of the new age, ever progressing with the constant acquisition of knowledge, guide us towards inevitable progress. Buckle describes these mental laws as superior to moral laws, due to his era witnessing progress being achieved purely by mental laws. Moral laws, as he states, are stationary, but mental laws are always improving and always adapting. Quote, "We have seen that as the progress of civilization is marked by the triumph of mental laws over the physical, just so it is marked by the triumph of intellectual laws over the moral ones." It was a certainty in these scientific principles that concerned Dostoevsky. He treasured the Russian soil and the Russian people. The imported Western ideas sought to indirectly destroy Russia and the Russian way of life by attempting to fix its inequality and what appeared to the Europeans as a stagnant culture. These new philosophies were exalted by many native Russians themselves, hoping to raise Russia to European standards. But by forcing a conversion, Russia would lose her cultural identity and her heritage. For after the fall of Constantinople, she inherited the title of Rome. Moscow was often referred to as the Third Rome. Peter the Great had succeeded in pulling Russia, kicking and screaming, I might add, into a one-sided cultural commerce with the West, and now the Russian idealists were trying to do the same. In his book, Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, Dostoevsky remarks that the Russian aristocracy have become essentially European. They shipped their children to the West, they read Western books, and more importantly, they wanted to transform themselves into Westerners. All the while, the Russian peasants had maintained their ties to the Russian soil. The Russian peasants composed the Russian soul. They were the inheritors of Constantinople. They had not been corrupted by Western ideals. Dostoevsky liked to put it, the West is naive, while the Russian is pragmatic and a realist. In Notes from the Underground man states, quote, "We, in our Russian land, have no fools. That is a known fact. That's what makes us different from those other German lands," end quote. The West was guided by its ideology, almost religiously, and this disturbed Dostoevsky severely. The underground man refers to many of these hopeless idealists as perfectly honest and having lofty hearts, but being guided with false certainty. Notes from the Underground was written in response to a work named What is to be Done by Nikolai Chernyshevsky in 1863. In it, Chernyshevsky gives examples of utilitarian philosophy by following the lives of his characters, Vera, Lopukov, and Kirsanov. Each exhibits the philosophy of rational egoism. Quote, man is governed exclusively by the calculation of his own advantage. He follows his own caprice, fantasy is whimsical, necessity decides for him. End quote. The character Lopukov marries Vera, but over time notices that she falls in love with their friend Kirsanov. Vera maintains her marriage and suppresses her emotion for Kirsanov, but Lopukov decides it's not conducive to his own self-interest to stay married to a woman whose emotion had led her to adore another man. He voluntarily suggests that he and Vera separate and requests that she pursue a relationship with Kirsanov. Lopukov could not stop Vera's affections from spreading to another man, and he knew that Vera would never leave him because of her commitment to the marriage. So he voluntarily resigns to what he thinks is best, not only for his own interest, but the interest of his wife and his friend. I believe this action is what is used by Chernyshevsky to illustrate the very foundational principles of rational egoism. Rational egoism is commented upon explicitly by the Underground Man. He asks, why would they, referring to the egoist, believe that man must necessarily have any reasonable advantageous desires? Man simply wants his own desires, his own independent desires. The Underground Man jokes that desire will eventually conspire with reason, and that we will stop desiring because desire is no longer in accordance with reason. Since reason can be calculated, the will may be predicted. Allowing that this natural progression of the philosophy occur, one can calculate their life 30 years in advance. The Underground Man then turns around in response to this reduction, saying that human nature lives, it has identity, it has individuality. It is not always something scientific. I want to end this introduction with a brief description of the end of the 4th chapter from Notes of the Underground. I believe it hits upon a major theme of the book and can give future readers and returning readers a true appreciation for the depth of the novel. The Underground Man conjures an image of a man with a toothache. The first day, the man groans, and his groans sound sincere. The second day, he groans, and his groans sound less sincere. By the third day, he groans, and his groans have lost all sincerity and are now produced out of spite. Spite for the illness, spite for his audience, and spite for his inability to halt the pain. But he continues to groan, not because it helps him any, but because it serves as an action, even if that action is loathsome and annoying. Man can control his actions, and that gives him identity, even if the sense of the identity is only for oneself, not for an audience. Mathematics cannot define an individual, but action can. In most instances, though, the Underground Man finds his identity intolerable, but his identity separates him from being merely another object in the world. It gives him significance. It gives him voice. It gives him himself, and that self exists within every one of us humans. Thank you.
Wow.
Now, here are the works that I read through, and does anyone have any questions? Yes.
How will your work be packaged with the translation of the book? Would you know that yet?
That's a good question. Dr. Lodge is currently working on it. I kind of went in, I did a lot of the groundwork for finding stuff within the context, finding references that the Underground Man makes. He makes makes about 18 references throughout the book. It's about all of these men, these philosophies that he thinks are very detrimental by nature. And so that's what I did. I went in and I analyzed the philosophies and what these men believed. And that's what Dr. Lodge is going to use on my half. She also has her own ideas about romantic decatism. And I think with those two ideas coming together, that's going to compose the introduction. And then actually the appendices also at the end of the book, which are just background materials, much of the primary sources that are on this list. Yes?
Do you know what happened that caused him to change his ideas on social ideology following his exile?
Yes, there's actually been quite a few attempts to get that answer. He was very influenced by socialist ideology, but he still seemed to be somewhat conservative before his exile. But when he was exiled, a Siberian woman gave him the New Testament. She gave him a copy of the New Testament. That was actually all he was allowed to read. And between reading that every night and speaking with the prisoners who themselves are not big fans of this new ideology, because for the most part, these prisoners are not white-collar crimes. They're blue-collar, thugs of the street. They're in Siberia away from civilization for a reason. And so they're very earthy people, very close to the soil. And so a lot of people have made the connection that because the New Testament inspired him, he's actually a well-known Christian writer for Russia, even though his ideas are somewhat hidden behind his characters. So the New Testament and meeting these prisoners who were just the salt of the earth really changed his perspective. And coming back from Siberia, he actually wrote a book called Notes from the House of the Dead, where a fictitious character meets other fictitious prisoners, but based on the prisoners that he met while in Siberia. And it shows just the harshness, the brutality that these prisoners had to face. And that all these guys, like all these aristocrats spreading these awesome ideas of socialism and stuff, and those guys are the bad guys to these prisoners. And so I think that would be a lot of what really changed his perspective. All right. Well, thank you.